I'm not an extravagant liver. I'm not stockpiling cars and diamonds and stuff like that. Beneath the glitter of 1970s Hollywood, one of its brightest stars was quietly preparing to vanish. At the height of her fame, Ally MacGraw had everything: critical acclaim, a powerful husband, and the world's attention. Then one man walked into her life and rewrote the script. It wasn't a scandal she chased, but something more seductive, more consuming. What followed wasn't just an affair. It was a choice that would upend her marriage, silence her career, and leave fans asking, how could someone so visible disappear so completely? The story she now shares is as revealing as it is haunting, and it begins with a knock on her door when Cool walked in. Ally MacGraw's life took an irreversible turn the day Steve McQueen walked into her world with the script for The Getaway. At the time, she was riding a wave of success, fresh from her acclaimed performance in Love Story, and married to powerful Paramount executive Robert Evans. Yet nothing in her carefully managed world prepared her for McQueen's presence. Intense, unpredictable, and completely magnetic. The second I saw him, I knew I was going to get in some serious trouble, Ally admitted in a later interview. He had an energy that disrupted the air in a room, a raw magnetism that drew people in without effort. She wasn't immune, and she wasn't ready for what would follow. Their connection on the set of The Getaway in 1972 was immediate and undeniable. McQueen wasn't just her co-star. He quickly became her obsession, and eventually her undoing. Behind the scenes, their chemistry evolved into an affair that would mark the beginning of the end of her marriage to Evans. Ally described her decision to leave Robert not as rational, but as emotional. I just dropped everything and went with Steve. It was a surrender to passion, to curiosity, and perhaps to a deeper need to be seen in a different light. McQueen offered danger and authenticity, two things missing in her polished Hollywood life. They were married in the year 1973. They seemed quite a couple to the world at large. The brooding, rebellious action hero, and the beautiful, intense, introspective woman. But what the world could not see was the emotional current that rippled from under. McQueen's unresolved trauma and Ally's slowly but surely being transformed into one willing to reinvent herself for love. Leaving a husband now, she had also left behind a budding career just around its zenith. And while such sizzle sparks tabloid headlines, there is a personal sacrifice that Ally would later find it hard to name, let alone understand. Years later, Ally would look back on such a moment. McQueen was at her doorstep with a film offer, not just a connection between career opportunity and romance. It was, in her words, a collision. He didn't merely introduce the concept of a role to be played, an error that would leave a shift in the lineage of relations patently too deep to be documented. With it commenced an association that rubbed her public image smoothly clean and substituted it with an all-consuming reality. The Steve McQueen chapter was not only about drama, but it was also about underground foundations, the beginning of transformations that would clearly shape all the other portions of her life, for better or worse. But falling for Steve was just the beginning. Living with him was an entirely different story. Living in McQueen's world. At first, life with Steve McQueen in Malibu appeared to be a dream realized. Ally MacGraw described their home as a cozy beachfront retreat nestled away from the scrutiny of Hollywood. The two escaped the industry's chaos, surrounding themselves with friends who valued simplicity over fame. Their days were slow and earthly, barefoot mornings on the sand, sunset barbecues, and stargazing with beer in hand. We were happy for a while, Ally recalled in 2020, remembering those early days with tenderness. There was comfort in their isolation, and for a moment it seemed like she had found something genuine and unfiltered. But beneath the tranquil exterior, the balance began to tilt. McQueen's craving for control, both of his surroundings and his relationships, began to shape the rules of their domestic life. He had long rejected the celebrity lifestyle, but his insistence on privacy came with emotional demands. He didn't just want solitude, he wanted submission. Allie, in her attempt to make the relationship work, adapted. "I played cook, cleaning lady, simple woman to the hilt," she later admitted, revealing the extent to which she muted herself to meet his expectations. Her former life, filled with scripts, fashion shoots, and public appearances, was gone. The emotional costs of their isolation soon began to show. While the picturesque world opened itself to rest, it did not shut itself off altogether from turmoil. Possessiveness and volatility on the part of McQueen, hand in hand with increasing abuse of alcohol, required fights repeatedly to convert their sanctuary into a battlefield. Allie, too, began drinking heavily, and what had been peaceful evenings before turned into tension and withdrawals of emotion. Their beach house was no longer a haven. It was where they were both disappearing into roles that did not reflect their truth. Later, the Malibu lifestyle would turn out to be for Allie the disillusioning, not as a new beginning, but rather as the slow unraveling of who she was. It was only the absence of public pressure that masked the deeper issue of willingly making herself small to keep McQueen happy. And in that narrowing of self, the woman who once captivated audiences began to fade into a version of herself that existed only to keep the peace. The sand, the ocean, the bonfires, they became a setting for a life wherein love was conditional and identity compromised. The haunted past. McQueen carried to the world, Steve McQueen was the epitome of cool, a Hollywood icon whose steely gaze and anti-establishment roles captured the rebellious spirit of a generation. But behind the effortless swagger was a man deeply affected by a lifetime of emotional abandonment. McQueen's father disappeared when he was just a baby, and his mother, reportedly an alcoholic and unstable, sent him off to live with relatives before placing him in a reform school for troubled boys. These early experiences left him with lasting emotional scars, including a pervasive mistrust of intimacy and a reflexive need to control his environment. He had been so damaged, Allie MacGraw would say later, describing the psychological baggage he carried into every relationship. What Allie initially mistook for mystery and independence soon revealed itself as emotional armor. McQueen's unpredictability and frequent mood shifts often kept her on edge. She admired his strength and moral convictions, but she was also confronted with his darker side, suspicion, jealousy, and emotional withdrawal. There was always an element of danger about him, she told People in 2018. While his bad boy charm was part of his public appeal, in private, it could be unsettling. Allie found herself learning how to navigate his moods, tailoring her words and behavior to avoid triggering his insecurities. Loving him wasn't just an act of affection. It was a constant emotional calculation. The more their relationship matured, the more controlling McQueen became. He insisted on a pre-nuptial agreement before marrying Allie in 1973, and strongly urged her to abandon her acting career. These demands did not feel like requests. Rather, they were an attempt to exert some of his control over her life, born from a deep, dark fear of being vulnerable or upstaged. "I made myself smaller for him," Allie later confessed in a closer weekly interview. She compromised her career and voice to appease the relationship, which could not tolerate equality. For McQueen, control was a form of protection. For Allie, it was a slow erasure of her identity, an exchange of pieces of herself for emotional survival. As time passed, Allie started to see that once again, McQueen's domineering presence acted as cover. Here was a man terrified of abandonment, a fear, ironically, that drove him to drive people away. She could see that behind his bombastic charm lay a man wounded and never truly healed. That realization might have lent some understanding, but it didn't lessen the burden of living next to him. Their love was passionate, yet never truly safe or liberating. It was more like a constant emotional workout. For Allie, the realization came too late to salvage anything, but it was a kind of truth that would go on to inform her processing of their years together well after he was gone. Allie's sacrifice for McQueen's demands. At the height of her fame, Allie MacGraw had the world at her feet. After her acclaimed performances in Goodbye Columbus and the global sensation Love Story, she was considered one of the most bankable and beloved actresses in Hollywood. Yet when Steve McQueen entered her life, she found herself at a crossroads between personal passion and professional purpose. McQueen, while admiring her talent, made it clear that he didn't want to share the spotlight. "He didn't want me to work," Allie later revealed, a boundary that shifted the balance of power in their relationship early on. The choice she faced was stark: maintain her rising career or give it up to fit the mold of McQueen's ideal partner. Allie made her decision swiftly and wholeheartedly. Not only did she walk away from a marriage with Robert Evans, a man who had championed her talent, but she also began turning down film offers and stepping away from the Hollywood machine that had just begun to embrace her fully. She chose instead to immerse herself in domestic life, prioritizing McQueen's needs and raising her son Josh, whom she had with Evans. The transition wasn't gradual, it was immediate and total. "I played cook, cleaning lady, simple woman to the hilt," she recalled in a 2024 Closer Weekly interview. This self-imposed transformation wasn't just about adapting to a quieter lifestyle. It was about surrendering her independence to make the relationship work. Both personal and professional were the effects of that surrender. The house he lived in was described as being possessive by McQueen, which went beyond the household and into the expression of Allie herself. He would get jealous whenever she had anything to do with other men, be it formal or informal, while he continued to live on terms that involved apparent flirting and indulging interests. Allie stepped away from the limelight but didn't get it back or even appreciate it. Rather, it worsened the imbalance between them. "I made up a kind of woman I thought would appeal to him," she confided, reflecting on how intrinsically she redesigned herself to preserve the ruse of harmony. But beneath that effort, her own voice was being steadily silenced. By the late 1970s, the cost of this self-erasure had become very evident. The girl had no progress in her career, lost faith in herself, and was almost without identity. With the marriage finally crumbling down in 1977, the truth left Allie with the emotional wreckage of a life built up by someone else's boundaries. McQueen's death in 1980 complicated it even more, not only missing the man who had once been in love with her, but also realizing that she had sacrificed so much without being truly seen. The years that followed would confront Allie with unpleasant realities as she entered treatment for alcoholism and what she later called love addiction. The long journey back to herself began with confrontation over what she had surrendered and why. The disappearance of Allie MacGraw. In the years following her marriage to Steve McQueen, Allie MacGraw began to lose herself, not through any single dramatic moment, but through a gradual and consistent erosion of identity. Once celebrated for her authenticity and on-screen presence, she retreated from the public eye, embracing a domestic life that bore little resemblance to the world she once ruled. Though she had once been heralded as the embodiment of natural elegance, she now found herself shaping every part of her being to align with McQueen's ideals. "Right from the beginning, I never showed him who I was," she later confessed, a stark admission of just how deeply she had buried her true self in an effort to keep the relationship intact. The transformation wasn't just internal, it manifested in the very rhythm of her life. At McQueen's insistence, Allie abandoned her career, traded scripts for chores, and disappeared from the Hollywood conversation. She cooked meals, cleaned the house, and played hostess in their secluded Malibu beach home. This version of Allie wasn't the woman who had graced magazine covers or swept up awards. It was someone constructed to avoid conflict and keep McQueen's insecurities at bay. In conforming to his expectations, she created a false version of herself that he could accept, but it came at the cost of creativity, independence, and self-expression. With the passage of time, the emotional burden resulting from this loss of identity was felt more and more. McQueen's jealousy and possessiveness often resulted in conflict towards almost any interaction with others, especially men. Allie's world became reduced to the four walls of the house and the limitations that McQueen placed upon her. Suppression of free speech went hand in hand with restrictions on interaction with the outside world. The relationship dynamic became one of emotional suppression and aroused by the white-hot intensity of passion. From that heady and charming woman, soon disappeared from the screens of Hollywood, trapped and fading in shadow under the demands of a man whose own pain required constant appeasement. Allie had begun to understand how that loss of identity had taken place some years after McQueen's death and her recovery from addiction. Therapy and examination of her life allowed her to perceive those patterns that had led her to such total compromise. "I'm finally beginning to feel comfortable in my own skin," was her statement in 2024 when she heralded a hard-won personal return to authenticity. It wasn't as if her disappearance had happened so violently. Her reappearance was loud, not as a starlet or the wife of a legend, but as a woman claiming truth after years of emotional invisibility. Her silence may have preserved the peace, but it couldn't contain what was coming next. Turbulence at full speed. What began as a fiery, all-consuming romance between Allie MacGraw and Steve McQueen eventually erupted into chaos. The passion that once held them together began to turn toxic, fueled by personal insecurities, substance abuse, and unhealed emotional wounds. Their Malibu home, which had once offered a sense of escape from the pressures of fame, became a pressure chamber of rising tension. "We were both drinking too much," Allie admitted, and that reliance on alcohol dulled their communication while sharpening their tempers. What could have been quiet moments together often devolved into shouting matches, power struggles, and emotional standoffs that left deep scars. McQueen's jealousy, a trait rooted in his own childhood abandonment, became increasingly suffocating. Allie recalled how he could be provoked by something as innocent as a casual glance toward another man. Yet the double standard was glaring. McQueen flirted openly and often, while policing Allie's behavior with cold precision. "You never knew what he was going to do or say or be next," she remembered, describing the psychological toll of living with someone whose moods could shift in an instant. While his charm had initially drawn her in, his unpredictability became a source of emotional exhaustion that no amount of compromise could mend. Infidelity further fractured their already broken marriage. Both McQueen and MacGraw had their share of infidelities during their relationship, not done out of rebellion, but as signs of emotional distance. Rumors were rampant about McQueen's affairs, especially with women near or around his film sets. Allie's own admission to infidelity was quieter, but spoke volumes about how far removed she had become from the woman she used to be. Then it was numbing silence. Numbness came next. Escape was all that was left. In 1977, the tension was unleashed. The relationship that once was her identity was now the one driving her to extinction. That year saw a separation, one that defined the twilight of a love that had burned the candle at both ends for far too long. 3 years later, McQueen would follow, taken by cancer, at 50 years of age. As Allie grappled with a relationship full of bliss and anguish, in the years that came after, she would refer to these moments as a roller coaster, one that spun out of control long before either would have the courage or clarity to step off. The break that couldn't be mended. By 1977, the marriage between Allie MacGraw and Steve McQueen had reached its inevitable conclusion. The love that had once consumed them was now buried beneath years of tension, mistrust, and emotional damage. Allie, having sacrificed her career, independence, and sense of self, was emotionally spent. "I had made myself into a version of a woman I thought he wanted," she later reflected, a painful admission that underscored just how far she had drifted from her authentic identity. Despite her efforts to appease McQueen's controlling nature, the emotional demands of their relationship became too much. Their bond, once magnetic, had become unsustainable. Choosing to leave McQueen wasn't just about ending a marriage. It was about reclaiming what little remained of herself. The Hollywood darling, who had graced magazine covers and film premieres, was now out of work and largely forgotten by an industry that had moved on. Allie had been absent from the screen for years, having put her creative ambitions on hold to be a wife and mother under McQueen's terms. As she walked away from their relationship, she was not only grieving the loss of a partner, but also confronting the empty space where her career, self-confidence, and dear dreams once lived. "Everything I thought was romantic about our life became claustrophobic and impossible," she later said, speaking to the emotional collapse that had slowly engulfed her. The separation had brought relief, but was quickly followed by the shadow of McQueen's illness. In 1979, he was diagnosed with pleural mesothelioma, a rare and aggressive cancer that has an established correlation of causation with asbestos. His health rapidly deteriorated, and he passed away in November 1980 at 50 years of age. Allie was heartbroken. Although they had separated, things had never really been done between them. There was never really closure, she reflected. The death marked the end of a turbulent chapter and stole from her the opportunity to resolve questions, pains, and unresolved feelings about the relationship. In the wake of McQueen's death, Allie entered a soul-cleansing period. With grief and a fractured sense of identity, she was left to spiral. Depression and alcoholism inundated her as layers of emotional suppression and self-sacrifice added to the burden. Into the Betty Ford Center, she determined to go. That decision marked the true beginning of her healing. Here, she began to address not only her addiction, but also all those years of abandonment, love addiction, and loss of self that characterized her relationship with McQueen. The break may have been legally final in 1977, but emotional healing was another story that would take more than a few decades, and every step required a refreshingly lucid sense of honesty before she would even begin to rebuild a life. The death that haunted her. Steve McQueen's death on November 7, 1980 was both sudden and symbolic. The abrupt end of a man who had lived at full throttle and burned through life as fiercely as he had through fame. Diagnosed just a year prior with pleural mesothelioma, an aggressive cancer tied to asbestos exposure, McQueen sought treatment in Mexico after exhausting options in the U.S. He died shortly after undergoing experimental surgery, leaving behind not only a cinematic legacy, but a wake of unfinished emotional business, especially for Ali MacGraw. Although they had divorced in 1978, his death reverberated through her in a way that surprised even her. "There was never really closure," she later said, capturing the ache of words left unsaid and pain left unprocessed. Despite the turmoil of their marriage, Allie never denied the depth of her love for McQueen. Theirs had been a relationship of intensity, thrilling and consuming, but also unbalanced and bruising. His passing stirred not only grief, but a cascade of unresolved emotions that she had long buried. Guilt over the compromises she made, sorrow over the parts of herself she'd lost, and confusion about the man who could be both tender and terrifying. "I was so in love with him," she admitted, even as she acknowledged the damage that love had done. It was this emotional complexity, love entwined with regret, that haunted her after his death. In many ways, McQueen's death forced Allie to come to terms with what their relationship actually cost her. It was not simply losing a man, it was about the loss of illusions. Allie had, in a way, thought that her relationship chaotic as it might be, could be fixed or understood over time. His death closed that door forever. She began to reflect upon not just who he was, but who she became in his presence. "I made myself disappear in that marriage," she later said, a profound statement attesting to the emotional void she was left with when he left. His death became a lens through which she began to assess bits and pieces of herself that she had given up to be with him. Up until many years later, he hovered in and about Ali's life as a ghost, without being romantic about it. He became one of the few reminders of this love story that had no resolution she could think of. She would eventually find her peace in the quiet rhythms of her later life. But the memories of their years together, both beautiful and bruising, would never completely leave her. She called the relationship a roller coaster, and when his death brought it to a sudden halt, the deafening quiet that followed was almost worse than the tumult. The fallout of loving. Steve. After Steve McQueen died in 1980, Ali MacGraw entered one of the most emotionally complex chapters of her life. From the outside, she had once embodied the perfect Hollywood fairy tale: rapid success, critical acclaim, and marriage to two of the most influential men in the film industry. But after the dust settled, Ali found herself grappling with the emotional debris left behind. She was no longer the star who had commanded box offices, but a woman who had dimmed her own light for love and was now unsure of how to find her way back. The public may have remembered her as the elegant actress from Love Story, but she barely recognized that woman anymore. Her grief over McQueen's passing brought a new layer of reckoning. Without the distraction of his powerful presence, Ali was left alone with a profound emptiness. The result of years spent people-pleasing, adapting and performing emotional gymnastics to preserve love at all costs. She admitted in retrospect that she had created a version of herself she believed would appeal to McQueen, highlighting how her true identity had been suppressed, not only throughout their marriage, but also in the difficult years that followed as she struggled to navigate life in the aftermath of their relationship. The emotional toll had outlived the relationship itself, and with her career having long stalled, Ali found herself aimless and unanchored. A major choice in her life was made when Bai checked herself into the Betty Ford Center in 1985. The initial diagnosis of an alcohol problem quickly turned into a much more profound and serious experience. A full confrontation with pattern that had emotionally and culturally governed her life for decades. Although self-abandonment usually occurred in romantic relationships, she traced its roots much more centrally into her childhood, when she witnessed her father's alcoholic rage, which set up her future as a chronic pleaser. As she told Closer Weekly, "I would demand outrageously from most people, every single one of them in a room liking me." And so it became the cornerstone of her healing, that painful yet liberating awareness of how the need to be loved has routinely taken people away from themselves. In the 1990s, walking out of Hollywood was not a retreat. It was a reclamation. She would be reconnecting in Tosuke, New Mexico. Location, beauty, and privacy also afforded emotional space to find herself beyond fame, addiction, or relationships. Here, surrounded by nature and a community, rooting Ali's quiet life in authenticity, she painted, gardened, and engaged herself in spiritual practices. In time, she began to recreate success, not as applause and headlines, but as self-respect and peace. Just when it seemed she had lost herself for good, life led her somewhere she never imagined, healing beyond the King of Cool. Today, Ali MacGraw lives a life defined not by stardom or scandal, but by stillness and intention. Her home in Tosuke, New Mexico, a serene village north of Santa Fe, offers the opposite of the Hollywood spotlight she once occupied. With its expansive skies, creative community, and natural beauty, it's a place where she has found grounding. "I'm very involved with the community. I have a life that makes me happy," she said in a 2024 Closer Weekly interview. Unlike the curated image she once had to maintain, her days now revolve around genuine passions: painting, gardening, animal welfare, and spiritual reflection. In the quiet of the desert, she has learned to listen to herself again. The transformation wasn't instantaneous. It came after decades of therapy, introspection, and hard-won realizations. Her recovery from addiction included more than sobriety. It involved untangling the need for validation that had shaped much of her earlier life. The daughter of a temperamental alcoholic father and an often volatile household, Allie grew up believing her worth was tied to keeping the peace, to being agreeable, to being loved at any cost. McQueen, for all his charisma, fit neatly into that unresolved emotional framework. But with age and clarity came the ability to see her patterns and break free from them. At long last, I am beginning to feel comfortable that I am wearing the right costume. My own skin, she reflected, signaling that she had finally outgrown the need to be anyone else. Yet Steve McQueen will remain forever part of her lore. He will not define her anymore. She speaks of him with rare honesty, not romanticizing the past, but grieving the loss with understanding and insight. His death, sad but the reality, became a shift point for her in understanding herself. By many accounts, that relationship's end marked the beginning of her real life, a life where she could be present without being performed. Love requiring no self-sacrifice and disappearing into somebody else's shadow. Thanks for watching. If you found Ali MacGraw's story as powerful as we did, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What surprised you most? What should we cover next? And don't go anywhere. Click the next video on your screen to dive deeper into the hidden stories behind Hollywood's most unforgettable stairs.